weirdos with the sick.
Black as night, resteth from our sight. White as light, mighty hectate make it right.
I myself am strange and unusual.
Merry meet and welcome to the Coven podcast. I'm Sharon.
And this is Wendy. I hope everyone's having a lovely October. I cannot get over how much I just love this month.
I know, me too.
Yeah. So, I wanted to tell you that yesterday, I'm really excited about this. I went with my daughter and we went to our local metaphysical shop.
Nice.
And I just had to stock up on a couple of supplies and things like that. But while we were there, and it's been a while since I've been in, while we were there, I realized that they've changed the layout of the store, which, stores do. So it's it's cut into three little sections, three different rooms. And so I was feeling drawn to this back room. And I was like really, really, really excited to go back in there because I was like, ooh, I feel this energy. It's like it's pulling me. So I went in there and I was immediately drawn to this one shelf. And I literally could feel the energy off of this shelf, like feeling it through my hands. The closer my hands got to the shelf, the more the energy would spread up, like it was going, like straight to my heart or something.
That's so awesome.
It was really awesome. And you're not really supposed to touch any of this stuff on the shelf, and you have to ask for help because, it's they only want serious people to be touching the items.
Really?
Yeah, because she makes most of the stuff. The owner of the store, she either makes most of the stuff or she blesses everything. So this one particular item, it was like this. It looked like a little pagan symbol, but it was round and it was kind of like, what a gong looks like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was like a pagan gong. And so it just had so much energy coming off of it. I would go to another part of the store and have to come back in front of this little gong. Like it just needed me to buy it, but I didn't get it because it was $120. But I was like, I'm out. But this is so cute.
Dang. That's really cool. That gong wanted to be rung.
Yeah,
it wanted
totally
a master,
did.
And it felt that you were worthy. That'd be cool if it only calls out to those that it likes.
I know. I wonder. I'm not sure, but it was so cool. Maybe one day I'll have an extra $120 laying around that I could go purchase something like that, but not right now.
Right? What if that was just her amazing witch skills as a businesswoman? She'll charm an object that's expensive and be like, now call to them, baby. Get that sale.
Yeah. I did end up getting a new stone. I got a moonstone, which I absolutely love. My daughter has one and I'm always borrowing hers. And when I hold hers, it's so cold and inviting. And I picked out a stone and I paid the $10 for it, which I usually don't pay for stones. I usually just locate them myself. In the wild.
That's
but I bought
lucky.
the stone. I know. I know, right? So I bought the stone and we brought it home and I was using it last night and mine is hot. Mine is opposite from hers. It's warm to the touch. When I touch it with my hand, it's warm, but if I touch it on my face, it's cold. So it's really weird.
Yeah. It's vibrating or something or giving off a different kind of energy.
Yeah. So I'm absolutely in love with it. Mm-hmm. Best purchase. Cheaper than $120.
Yeah, that's really cool. And you can so connect to crystals just by keeping it in your pocket with you on days when you need an extra boost or charging it in the moon.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's exciting.
Yes.
I didn't really get anything super witchy this week. I really wanted to decorate my altar for the fall season. But we don't even have any leaves here in Texas. There's no orange leaves anywhere. So I went to the Dollar Tree and bought fake orange leaves just to put on my altar.
Oh, that's so cool though. I mean, I'm glad you're getting into the spirit.
Yeah, I'm I want to decorate and I want there to be nature, and I like that, you can see a star shape in leaves, and that's kind of a little pentagram. Yeah. And so I'm going to try to decorate that later today.
Very cool. This is a big month. October's our new year. So this week I know for certain I was probably doing a sente pot every day, just saying a blessing for my family every single day.
That's really intense.
Yeah, it was really intense.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure your house smells lovely.
It does, yeah.
All right, so we're going to move on because we have a big episode today, and we are going to be discussing some of the gruesome history of mass witch hunts, including the Salem witch trials. And in their honor, I have lit a black candle to absorb negative energy. It's time for Cauldron Topics. And because this episode is about the horrible murders of thousands of people accused of black magic, we wanted to share the truth and lighter side of witchcraft and clarify what we truly believe in. So we're going to break down the beautiful poem The Wiccan Ride by Doreen Valentine. And then we're going to discuss a little bit about the terminology. This has meant a lot to me, and I found it early on when I got into paganism, and it's really helped shape my craft and given me something to memorize and use in my practice. And her poem still resides in my Book of Shadows to this day.
I love that. That's so beautiful. Well, I'd never heard this poem before. You were the one who actually introduced it to me right before we started doing podcasting, and it's so beautiful. I'm excited that we're going to talk about it. But before we actually delve into the beautiful poem and start reading it, I wanted to talk about who Doreen was. Doreen was dubbed the mother of modern witchcraft, and she was born January 1st, 1922, and was a practicing witch for about 64 years of her 77 years of life. Although she had to keep her beliefs hidden for many years, she blossomed into a Wiccan priestess. She's written several books and several poems, and a couple of them were even published after she passed away. I feel like as witches, we should really strive hard to keep this woman's legacy alive. She just lived such an interesting life. The more I read on her, I found out that she actually started doing this when she was really young. Like, she just did a spell for her family when she was like 12 or 13, and her mom got really mad about it and sent her to this private school. And so I was like, what? That's horrid. Why would her parents do that? But they thought she might have been possessed or something.
Mm-hmm. She had to fight for her rights to be a witch.
Yes, totally. But she still kept coming back to it. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, I don't think that you can ignore the calling sometimes.
Right. I totally understand how that feels. Okay, so let's start reading this beautiful poem, The Wiccan Ride. Bide within the law you must, in perfect love and perfect trust. Live you must and let to live, fairly take and fairly give. For tread the circle thrice about to keep unwelcome spirits out. To bind the spell well every time, let the spell be said in rhyme. Light of eye and soft of touch, speak you little, listen much. Honor the old ones, in deed and name. Let love and light be our guides again. Docile go by the waxing moon, chanting out the joyful tune. Widdershins go when the moon doth wane, and the werewolf howls by the dread wolfsbane. When the lady's moon is new, kiss the hand to her times too. When the moon rides at her peak, then your heart's desire seek. Heed the north wind's mighty gale, lock the door and trim the sail. When the wind blows from the east, expect the new and set the feast. When the wind comes from the south, love will kiss you on the mouth. When the wind whispers from the west, all hearts will find peace and rest. 9 woods in the cauldron go, burn them fast and burn them slow. Birch in the fire goes to represent what the lady knows. Oak in the forest towers with might, in the fire it brings the gods in sight. Rowan is a tree of power, causing life and magic to flower. Willows at the water's side, stand ready to help us to the summer land. Hawthorn is burned to purify, and to draw a fairy to your eye. Hazel the tree of wisdom, and learning adds its strength to the bright fire burning. White are the flowers of apple tree that brings us fruits of fertility.
Grapes grow upon the vine, giving us both joy and wine. Fir does mark the evergreen to represent immortality seen. Elder is the lady's tree, burn it not or cursed you'll be. 4 times the magic sabbats mark the light and in the dark. As the old year starts to wane, the new begins, it's now Samhain. When the time for Imbolc shows, watch the flowers through the snows. When the wheel begins to turn, soon the Beltane fire will burn. As the wheel turns to Lammas night, power is brought to magic rite. 4 times the minor sabbats fall, use the snow to mark them all. When the wheel has turned to Yule, light the log, the honored ones rule. In the spring, when night equals day, time for Astar to come our way. When the sun has reached its height, time for oak and holly to fight. Harvesting comes to one and all, when the autumn equinox does fall. Heed the flower, bush, and tree, by the lady blessed you'll be. When the rippling waters go, cast a stone, the truth you'll know. When you have and hold a need, hearken not to others' greed. With a fool no season spend, or be counted as his friend. Merry meet and merry part, bright the cheeks and warm the heart. Mind the threefold law you should, 3 times bad and 3 times good. When misfortune is enow, wear the star upon your brow. Be true in love, this you must, do unless your love is false to you. These 8 words the ride fulfill, and ye harm none, do what ye will. Whew,
All right.
that was a mouthful.
That was a big one. Yeah, it was a big one.
Yes.
All right, let's talk about some of these pagan terms.
Yes.
So we have tread the circle. That literally just means cast. Old ones means gods and goddesses. Docile means turn right or clockwise. Widdershins means counterclockwise. And Summerland is the afterlife.
Yeah, I remember first hearing about Summerland when I started reading about like Wicca and how they believe in like an afterlife, and it's just like a hilly, grassy place, like a utopia.
Uh-huh.
So I thought that was kind of a nice idealistic version of the afterlife.
Yes, absolutely.
And then the other terms that you're going to see in here are the 4 major Sabbats. And there's Samhain, which sometimes is pronounced Samhain. I think for the purpose of the rhyme, it rhymed better with Samhain, but I prefer Samhain. So it's the witch's new year, and it's the time between the living and the dead. It's said to be at the thinnest, and it's a good time to like commune and honor like the dead relatives. And we'll talk about that more actually next episode. The other major Sabbat was Imbolc, and that just marks the beginning of spring, and it's around February. Next, there's Beltane, which is a starting point from spring to summer, and that's when you'll see the tradition of like maypoles and jumping over bonfires. There's Lammas in the poem, and that is a cross-quarter day between the summer solstice and the autumn equinox. Most of these Sabbats are all just marking the different times of the year. Next, there's Yule, which is basically like Christmas. It's just like a winter solstice, and that's when we are celebrating like the rebirth of the god. Ostara is another minor one. That's a spring equinox. So yeah, I thought that it's pretty interesting that she puts all of the Wiccan like practices in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't come across when she actually wrote this poem. Would be really interesting to know at what point in her life that she had already learned all of this. Mm-hmm. So I hope one day maybe we'll do an episode about just her someday to just talk more in depth about who she was.
Yes, and doing this research, I think we were both really inspired about famous practitioners and just to learn more about them. So we'll try to include that more in the podcast. If anyone has a practitioner they're interested in, let us know in the comments below, and we'll try to research them.
Yes, absolutely. I look forward to that kind of research because it's empowering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's, I guess, move on to our witch hunt stuff.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about some mass witch killings. So in my reading, the first thing I realized is that my previous learning about witch trials is very minimal. The thing is, when I was growing up, I only knew about the Salem witch trials, which, I mean, are a horrible thing that happened, but so small in the comparison of everything that else has happened. So in my discovery, I found the real history of how many people were murdered. Witch hunts actually started around 300 BC. And after some deep research, I believe that there was an influx of mass witch killings that started in the late 1400s and ended in the late 1700s, which might be a lie because some countries still actually kill witches today. One of the most recent actual accounts of a practicing witch being killed was Amina bint Abdul Halim Nassar. I'm so sorry if I butchered that. She was beheaded on June 19th in 2012 in Saudi Arabia for actually practicing witchcraft.
Okay, so she was genuinely a witch.
She was genuinely a witch and was murdered. In total, it is truly unknown how many supposed witches have been murdered through the years. I was just really flabbergasted that we as a human race have allowed it to go on. Even though I know there have been many mass killings all over the world for centuries unrelated to witches, this one just feels a little personal to me. Unless we change our ways, we will never truly be able to move on as a people. So my research uncovered the European witch trials, and these happened between 1450 and 1750, and during that time period alone, about 200,000 people were murdered or tortured. That is mind-blowing.
It is.
And as I said before, this amount of people listed might be way less or more because the death may not have been kept track of. We may never find out exactly how many people died. And for the sake of time, I'm probably only going to discuss a few accounts. Should be said that there are many accounts of people just murdering people during this time period. I read account after account of just plain murder in order to gain riches or land. Even if they weren't witches, they just lied about them being witches just to murder them so that they could have what they had.
Yeah, I think it was a bloody time period, and violence was a go-to for a lot of people.
Right. And this was just a way for it to be allowed. You know what I mean? It was like, oh, we're just going to use the name of the witch.
Exactly.
To allow this to happen. So, and rather than being tried as murders, they just were tried as witches. It should also be noted that many were tortured into saying they were a witch or called upon demons and the devil. The torture would last long enough for them to confess to witchcraft. So people would be arrested or being accused of being a witch, and then they would be tortured to the point that they said, okay, you're right, I am a witch, or I do worship the devil. Mm-hmm. And then they would be like stopping the torture. The person would say, actually, I lied to you just to get you to stop.
Yeah, I think that's really common as well in the witch trials anywhere. Like, they were just searching for that confession, and they were hoping if they did confess, then at least it would stop.
Right. And then those people would still be murdered. They would be beheaded, and it's just horrible. So the first European witch trial I came across were the Vala witch trials that occurred from 1428 to 1430. The area this took place was in what we consider Switzerland. There were approximately 200 witches, about 132 male and 68 female, who were burned to death. These people were said to commit many acts of sorcery. For instance, some of them admitted to killing and eating their own children. They caused blindness in other people. They caused women to have miscarriages. They said that they could also make this special salve that they would put on a chair and then use to fly around. And there were accounts of people making potions to be invisible. And they used this invisibility to ruin crops on other people's farms. Somebody that had done harm to them.
That was always the go-to. Yeah. Oh, they ruined my farm. You know, why at a time like that, you're probably relying heavily on trading different kind of crops with your neighbors, and people went through famine and food was scarce. Who would really benefit from destroying a neighboring field?
Yeah, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Unless they were really horrible people.
True, which sounds like these people kind of were.
Yeah. So moving on to the next little subject, this next bit of information wasn't exactly a witch trial, but it really meant that witch hunts were legal according to the Catholic Church. So I felt that it was really important to bring it into this. On December 5th, 1484, there was a doctrine called the Summus Desiderantis Effectibus. Now, because I don't speak Latin, I hope I said that correct. It was issued by Pope Innocent VIII. This doctrine's title is Latin for Desiring of Supreme Ardor. Pope Innocent VIII was on his throne from 1484 to 1492. And in my opinion, that was too long. He was a horrible man with a horrible mind. He was for slavery. Just everything that he did was some horrific, horrible thing. So his doctrine said, I wrote the whole text down. I don't know if I'm going to read the whole thing, but basically it says, any persons of both sexes, unmindful of their own salvation and straying from the Catholic faith, have abandoned themselves to devils, incubi, and succubi, and by their incantations, spells, conjurations, and other accursed charms and crafts, enormities and horrid offenses have slain infants yet in the mother's womb. So basically he's just saying, if these people have done this stuff, it's allowed that we punish them to death. Mm-hmm. And that we damn them to hell forever, for eternity. So he was just saying, look, if you've ruined somebody's crops, if you caused a woman to have miscarriage, if you had sex with somebody you shouldn't have had sex with, if you did anything that was against our Catholic law, then we're punishing you.
Yeah, and I mean, he's mentioning devils, incubi, succubi. Like, I think people back then, they genuinely believed in these things. Because doubting the devil would be doubting God. So you thought that these types of creatures were out there and kind of planting things in people's minds.
I just felt that it allowed the Catholic Church to use their religion to cause harm to other human beings because they didn't follow their paradigm.
Oh, yeah. I think there's plenty of men who wield it that way.
It's just crap. Mm-hmm. It's just crap.
Superstition mixed with, like, just prejudice and...
So the next set of trials I came across it was called the Great Scottish Witch Hunts, which actually took place for a long period of time from 1590 to 1662. Unfortunately, during this time period, Scotland had 5 major witch hunts. The others were just one-offs. It was like one person here, one person there. But through the years, close to 6,000 people were accused of witchcraft. And of those 6,000, 1,500 were executed by various means.
Wow.
So I know, right? That is a lot of people. Like, a lot. In some cases, it was a situation where someone would speak ill of a person a building or even a boat, which I thought was ridiculous. Like, they said there was a story and they're saying someone came out and said, "Oh, that boat is hideous. I wish that it never existed." Then the boat would be in an accident and therefore that person would be considered to be a witch.
Mm-hmm.
So
this is our go-to for a lot of things.
Right. So it was basically just a bunch of people wishing something bad would happen and then it would come true. And that was considered to be witchcraft.
Yeah.
In some instances, there were farm animal mutilations in the name of the devil. Some trials were in regards to the witch divining with items. I mean, some of these people were actually witches. Like, they would use special salves and medicines. And back then, I guess medicine that we would be considered real medicine today may have been considered witchcraft back then because it wasn't ordained by the church, I think is what I read.
Yeah, and like from what we were talking about last week, like folk magic, these kinds of things were all considered to be magic. So a woman in the village who was known for healing with herbs was the town witch.
Right, exactly. Even though she probably went to church every Sunday.
Yeah.
Let's see. The Scottish were extremely concerned about anyone involved with witchcraft, mainly due to the fact that they were most likely involved with the devil. Unfortunately, at the time, Scotland was ruled by England, and therefore their way of life was set forth by English law. England was against anything that was not for the one true God, so to speak. Anyone who was a non-believer was considered to be in bed with the devil and a witch. I mean, it's just reiterating this over and over again, that they may have been full-blown witches or they may have just been a regular person that had a different mindset and were accused of being a witch.
Right, exactly. I think that's all it was for a majority of it, mixed with superstition.
Right. Then I came across the Bamberg witch trials, which were between 1626 and 1631, and they happened in southern Germany. During that time period, 4 years, 300 to 600 witches were killed. All of them were tortured before being executed, severely tortured, like nails ripped off, hair pulled out.
That's horrible.
It was horrible torture. There were intense records kept. I believe some of them they still have in museums over in Germany. Mm-hmm. So they kept track of the type of torture that they did before the people were killed. I actually started refusing to research if they displayed. I mean, like, I was like, oh my gosh, they torture these people. I'm not going to research all of this information. I just felt so sickened.
It's so dark, and it's hard not to get affected by it.
Yeah, I was completely affected by it. So another unfortunate part of this was that many of those who were accused and executed weren't witches. They were just wealthy people in the town who were wrongfully accused. And then the Prince Bishop, who was Johann George Fuchs von Dornheim, he ordered these people to be executed so that he could steal their wealth. It kind of reminded me of that Robin Hood movie when we were kids, that cartoon. Like, oh, you know what? I'm the Prince Bishop and I need your money. So if you can't give me all of your taxes, I'm going to say you're a witch. We're going to murder you and I'm going to take it.
Yeah, it's a bloodthirsty time when you can just sweep violence under the rug with just saying, oh, witchcraft. Now I get your shit.
Yeah. So then he had this prison built, which they called Durrant House. I did look that one up to see if it was still there. It burned down in 1635. So when the witch trials ended, they kept the building for a little while, and then they burnt it down themselves.
Why would it be just a specific witch prison? That's creepy.
Yeah, they used to do all of their torture in there.
I'm glad it's burned down.
So I know, right?
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh. So they would arrest the witch, take her to this specific prison, and then torture them, and then have them executed in front of thousands of people.
Horrifying.
So then I came across another set. My study took me to Brazil. There were about a couple hundred executions that happened in Brazil, but they were not for the same type of witchcraft that was over in Europe. They were mostly of those who were using potions to stop themselves from being pregnant, or they would use specific perfumes to lure men into their beds. So basically they were all just prostitutes, but they considered them to be witches because they believed it to be a form of magic, but it wasn't the type of magic that the Brazilians believed in, because it was was regarding birth control and that kind of stuff. That was against their types of magic.
That's just before the Enlightenment period. So science wasn't really a thing. So people everything was based off of superstition and religion.
Right.
It's crazy.
I do have to say about Brazil, though, is that they did believe, and I think still to this day, they believe in a lot of magic. It's just, they were like, well, this magic is okay, but this magic, not okay. They were totally okay with, like, if they felt someone was possessed, if the local, they didn't call them witches, they called them something else. It was some sort of hoodoo kind of thing where they would bring in the shaman in and the shaman would exorcise the demons out of them. So they believed in that kind of stuff, and they believed using salves and things like that. But they just didn't like these prostitutes. Mm-hmm. So they had them murdered.
Yeah. And that was like 1630s or 40s.
Yeah. Yeah.
So between like that time period and when people started colonizing America, a lot of those kind of witch hunts had died down in Europe, is what I was hearing. I think there was just less superstition and bothering people over practicing folk magic. They kind of just let it rest for a while.
Right.
But yeah, so like the Salem witch trials at that time, like the colonies were trying to escape Europe to just have their own religious freedom. And in that time, they became really superstitious and rigid and wanted to like strictly follow the Bible with their Puritan views. So they said they want religious freedom, but they're still just kind of controlling themselves. So the Salem witch trials was a movement of violence, intolerance, paranoia, and just unjust prosecution. Just basically more of what we've been talking about. And no one really knows why the girls in this town started behaving oddly. And there are many things that may explain it. For example, at the time there was smallpox epidemic going on in Salem that very year, and the winter was really harsh, worse than usual, so people were dealing with really cold, freezing temperatures. And there were wars with the Indian tribes that were taking place like only 70 miles away from Salem. A lot of the people who lived in Salem were actually refugees of like mass Indian slaughterings and murderings, and they have gone through these things, especially little girls who end up acting like crazy and afflicted. So the main thing on everyone's mind, I think, in Massachusetts at that time was just violent deaths and fear, superstitions, and it just spread and created like a hysteria. At that time, Indians were viewed as devil worshippers and witches were viewed as servants of the devil, and the Puritans believed the devil was just out there in the wilderness, and waiting to prey on people.
Oh, it was just chupacabra.
Exactly. Just a blood-sucking chupacabra in Massachusetts. And like the events, they take place in 1692. So I guess that was a little bit further. That was more like 60 years from the stuff you were talking about.
Yeah.
And so they're generally referred to as the Salem witch trial, but there were actually two overlapping and distinct geographic areas that were in Salem, Massachusetts. There was Salem Village, which is a little more rural. And then like 5 miles apart, there was this Salem town, and it was more of like a busy fishing port. And so it happened in this like spread between those two areas. And the strange events began happening in Salem Village on January, when Puritan Reverend Samuel Parris and his wife Elizabeth noticed his daughter Betty and niece Abigail Adams were behaving oddly. And they were just having like crazy fits and just contorting their bodies in weird ways and screaming. And they were crying out in pain that they were like being pinched and tortured by something invisible. And, this wasn't like a new concept that the girls just came up with. And it didn't, in my opinion, I don't think they were organically feeling anything. They were just acting out. So at this time, there was the really renowned Reverend Cotton Mather. He had written a really popular book about 3 years prior to this. And it was called Remarkable Providences. And it just describes in detail like a possession of children that was happening of the Goodwin family up in Boston. And so I think it was just possible that these girls had heard about these kind of things or had been aware of them. And so with all that, like that fear and hysteria being spread, just stuff started happening.
Yeah, so they just were imitating what they read.
Yeah, that is a theory that scholars have come up with. So like a month later, Reverend Parris, he starts to believe that the girls are bewitched as well, like going off of those kind of teachings. So like I said earlier, these people were really superstitious and they definitely believed in the devil and that possession was a possibility. So one day Samuel and Elizabeth, they left home to a neighboring town to attend a religious sermon. So in their absence, they had this nosy neighbor, Mary Sibley, and she instructed their Native American slave Tituba to help her smoke out the witches. And I just want to backtrack on Tituba for a second. There was just a lot of speculation coming up and misconceptions when I was doing research that people think that Tituba was the beginning of the witch trials. And they think that because as a slave she was bought in Barbados, that she was like a voodoo priestess, and that she had learned all those things while in Barbados and then brought it here to Salem. But there is not one shred of evidence of that ever happening. No one mentions any kind of voodoo or anything like that. And in the court records, she's actually put down as a Native American. So it's possible that she made it down into Barbados and was still sold into slavery. And then from there, there's records of her being purchased and brought to Salem. But she was not like teaching anybody voodoo. And this is a trope that's popularized too by the play and the movie The Crucible. Like in the opening scene is Tituba in the woods doing weird magic, and she's the one who kind of taught all the women, and they're just like dancing around in the woods. And none of this really ever happened. And in fact, I read that the Crucible is just like an allegory for communism. So there's no really historical truth going on. There's just a lot of bending of truth. So keep that in mind if you watch that movie. So anyway, the neighbor, Mary, she taught Tituba how to make a witch cake. And a witch cake was said to detect the girl's tormentor. And this was like known as a counter-magical folk remedy. So she was kind of using like white magic to try to figure out where the black magic was coming from. Okay. And so she told Tituba to bake a cake, loaf, or rye bread mixed with the two girls' urine.
Disgusting.
Exactly. I don't know really how she collected that. I guess just from their bedpans. And then she had to feed it to the family dog. And so when the dog eats the cake, it's supposed to reveal the witch's identity somehow. And so the afflicted girls like soon started crying out that Tituba was the one tormenting them, and that it was her fault that all these things were going down. So this whole thing of the witch cake really backfired on her, but she was just listening to like the white lady tell her what to do, you know? She didn't have a choice.
Right. She was just doing her job.
So the afflictions of the girls grew worse, and they started saying that Tituba's specter, which is something I had to look up because constantly in Salem they're going to reference a specter. And at that time it was believed to be a spirit form of the person that was invisible to anyone else who wasn't being tortured. But it was controlled by the devil, and so the devil would send the witch's specter to go, like, mess with other people. And so they were saying that's what was happening, that her specter was torturing them. And so ministers were invited over to their house, and they observed the girls, and they just concluded, yes, this is an attack of Satan, and they took this all as fact, and it just really grew from there. So rumors of the witches and the hysteria spread to these other girls on the village to suffer similar afflictions, the 12-year-old Ann Putnam and then 17-year-old Elizabeth Hubbard. So they started acting the same way, and they were kind of in with the whole Puritan group as well. So it was all these Puritan families that were witnessing these events, and those were the children that were spreading this kind of hysteria. The girl Anne, she said that the specter of a villager named Sarah Good was pinching her and trying to convince her to sign the Devil's Book, which was an act that would establish like a formal covenant with Satan. And Sarah Good was just a poor woman of the town. She was kind of a beggar. She was really known for just being like sharp-witted and having outbursts, so not a really popular woman. And then Elizabeth, she said she was being stalked by a wolf sent by Sarah Good. And I guess back then, if you saw like a black wolf or like a giant hog, like this was supposed to be something from the devil. Like I said earlier, people were extremely superstitious. It's like today when people are afraid of black cats. It was just like any kind of animal back then.
That's just so...
Yeah.
It makes people sound dumb.
It does, and it's hard to just really put yourself in the mind state of pilgrims back then and what they were dealing with, because nowadays we just think that's ridiculous.
Right. You're like, what was in that cake you were eating?
Mm-hmm.
What were you on?
Yeah, apparently girls' urine as well as in the cake.
Yeah, gross.
So yeah, she was being followed by that wolf, and then she also drug in another girl's name into it, Sarah Osborne. And she claimed that she saw Sarah Osborne talking to a short and hairy thing with legs and wings, so she was almost describing like a little demon or like a little devil. And Osborne was a woman, she was really ill health and bedridden. She was just an outcast. And she had caused scandals in the community because she had purchased the contract of this indentured servant and then turned around and married him. And people just thought that was salacious. Like, they did not see how she could get away with doing that. So I think these two girls just have Puritan values kind of poured on them, and they were pulling at the people who had bad, like, rumors about just the outcast. So at this point, there were 4 girls who were claimed to be afflicted and 3 women being accused of witchcraft. So they were arrested and taken in for a hearing. And the room was crowded with townspeople. The accused were questioned one at a time. and they started with Sarah Good, and it was done by the local magistrate John Hawthorne, and he was just grilling them more for a confession, not really acting like an impartial judge. Like, the questions that I found that he said were like, what evil spirits have you familiarity with? Have you made contact with the devil? And why do you hurt these children? Like, he was just grilling them for these types of answers. And Sarah was denying all of the claims. And so the 4 girls that were the afflicted ones, they started screaming and acting tormented and getting all twisted and withering in pain again. And they were claiming that Sarah's spirit, like her specter, was lunging out of her body and attacking them, like in the very room. So the judge took this as fact, and he just determined right then and there that Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were good to go for trial. This hysteria was being believed without question. They questioned the Tituba, and she initially denied the charges against her, but Hawthorne just kept grilling her, so she started weaving all these stories and admitted that she was a witch. She described how Satan revealed himself to her, and she said that she saw a dark thing like a man, and he told me to serve him. And she ended up being like the star witness. Her testimony basically confirmed the fears that witches were loose in Salem. And Tituba drug Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good into it and said that they had attacked her, blinded her, and prevented her from speaking freely up until that point. She said that she had signed the Devil's Book with her own blood and that she had seen Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne's mark on there as well, along with 9 other signatures inside.
So, I don't know. Do you think that Tituba was tortured at all?
I think she was just trying to save her own hiney.
Oh, okay.
Because in Salem, it seems like if you confessed, they wouldn't really mess with you from there.
Okay.
I think that, like, she was being encouraged, because her questioning took place over 4 days. And I think people were saying, this will all stop if you just confess.
Gotcha.
So all these stories kind of just started coming out of her.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone really was hurting her or torturing her. I didn't read any of that.
Okay.
So kind of like what we were talking about earlier, the accused witches, they just tend to be like poor and marginalized women. They broke norms of society. So, the fact that they had picked a Native American slave and a beggar and a scandalous woman, it just kind of made sense. On top of that, Salem Village and Salem Town were really divided into 2 fractions at that time. And the Putnams were a family that dominated most of Salem Village. Thomas Putnam Jr. and his wife Anne were really powerful supporters of the Puritan minister Samuel Parris, and they were really pushing for the idea that Salem Village would have its own church. Everyone else who was anti this was like, look, I would rather walk 5 miles to the church in the other town than pay double taxes for 2 churches nearby.
Okay.
So that was like
Gotcha.
the 2 different groups, one supporting a new church, one in denying of that. And that was a big fraction of the accusers were the church supporters, and the ones that were being accused of witchcraft were the non-supporters. So a lot of these cases were because of the Putnam family. Between Thomas, his wife, daughter, his niece, and their servant, they together accused 181 different people on witchcraft.
Oh my goodness.
So this family was really at the core of it.
Those Putnams.
Exactly. Those nosy Putnams. So there was this guy, John Proctor, and he was really outspoken about the witch accusations from the beginning and the lack of evidence. And he was just saying that the afflicted girls were frauds and they were liars. He was a main player in the Crucible as well. And something I wanted to point out is that John Proctor is actually 60 years old at this time. So not at all like the movie where he's just like young
and handsome.
Yes, because like I was Googling John Proctor and the only image that would come up was Daniel Day-Lewis serving cheeky and Puritan realness, black and white picture, and his chest was out and his flowing hair. I'm like, he looked nothing like that. And like in the
media.
Exactly. They just kind of sexified him and made him more of like a charming martyr. But he was kind of just a grouchy old man, but he was pretty much right about them being frauds and liars. And again, in the Crucible, something that they tried to say was that he was having an affair with his servant, Mary Warren, who was played by Winona Ryder. And that's just completely false because Mary was like 11 at this time.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And he was 60.
Yeah, and he had a pregnant wife actually during all of this. Like, I don't think he was doing that.
Yeah.
So anyway, in March, his servant Mary, she began having these fits and started acting crazy too. So he kind of took things into his own hands and he beat her in an attempt to get her to behave and to stop, like with these fits. She didn't stop. She did stop for like a month, and she even tacked like a sign on the door of the meeting house in town. And she was just like asking for prayers of thanks for this development, and just being like, "Oh," she stated, "the afflicted persons did but dissemble." So people at the time didn't really know what she meant by that. And some just took it that the girls were lying. But because of that note, the other afflicted girls turned on Mary and they started accusing her of being a witch. So she had to go under questioning. She confessed that she had signed the devil's book, but only because John and his pregnant wife Elizabeth tricked her into it. So John became the first man accused of witchcraft in Salem, which is pretty crazy. I assumed that everyone was a woman, but that wasn't the case at all.
Right.
So not long after, Ann Putnam testified that she saw the specter of Reverend George Burroughs, and he became the second man accused of witchcraft. She said that he confessed to killing his first 2 wives, which they did pass, but for different reasons, and that he bewitched the Indians to attack nearby villages, and that he was behind all these crazy attacks that were going on. And the accusations actually seemed to be more of like a personal revenge, because he owed the Putnam family money. See, he was the minister before Paris took over, and the town at that time was facing hardships, so they would withhold his earnings, and he actually never got paid. So the Putnams tried suing him, but it really didn't go through because Burroughs just said, look, if I can't pay my debts until his debts get paid to him, that's owed to him from the town. So this was something that the Putnams never forgave. Like, they always had a disdain for him, and I think they were just looking for an excuse to throw him under the bus. The spectre accusation led to his arrest, and it caused a huge sensation because now not only was he a man, but he was a man of faith being accused of witchcraft. So the following day after that, the first victim of the witch trials died. It was not because of a hanging, but because the prisons were so cold. Sarah Osborne died in prison just due to the poor conditions. Not only was it freezing, but there were chamber pots in there and they were left unchanged. And I found out that at that time, if you were in jail and you wanted fresh or clean straw, you had to pay for it yourself. So they were really profiting from the prisoners' suffering. They would charge them for everything. There was a lack of justice, and it just continued. Over 40 people were placed in that jail, including John Proctor and his wife Elizabeth. May 14th, so a couple months after this has started, 4 months, they had a new governor, William Phips. He arrived in Boston, and he was really ill-prepared to deal with the whole witch trials. The whole thing had really reached unprecedented proportions in America. And at this time, I found out that Puritans were encouraged to sue one another. It was a really common thing to take your neighbor to court. And this was it was an attempt to stop physical violence from breaking out between the colonies. And so I think this is kind of part of it that played into that, why everyone was accusing everyone and going to court over these issues. The Salem witchcraft crisis came at a time before Massachusetts even had a legal system to deal with it, because when Governor Phips came, he brought with him a new charter for Massachusetts Bay. It invalidated all the laws and the courts in the colony. So they were in this limbo period waiting for a new legislature to pass and a new set of laws. And it was scheduled to take place on June 8th, but Governor Phips could not wait until then, so he created a court, and it was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which translates to hear and determine. So this court system was led by Governor William Stoughton and 8 other judges, really with no legal or court training whatsoever. So they just kind of set this court system up to deal with the witch trials. And they had several means of identifying witches, either through a witch's confession or to 2 eyewitnesses to an act of black magic. So lacking proof, they would also search the accused homes for potions, poppets, charms, spells, that kind of thing. But it was a really rare find in Salem. They turned to other means, and they turned to spectral evidence. They took that as fact, and the court relied heavily on it. So, I think I mentioned earlier, it's if you were to doubt these kind of spirits, that's to doubt, again, God's existence. So to them, this stuff was really real. One of the judges did question the method, though. He was like, well, what about false specters, created by Satan to falsely blame an innocent man? The devil's a trickster. How can you really trust him? And the specters that he's putting out there are even genuinely witches. But he was reassured by a minister that God would protect the innocent person. So Satan could not falsely accuse the innocent. They're just super religious and hopeful that God will take care of everything while blaming Satan for everything.
Right. Like a scapegoat.
Yeah.
It was a total scapegoat.
Yes, definitely. And actually, when the witches would be taken in for trial, they would be stripped down by these examiners, and they would look head to toe over their entire body to find something called a devil's mark or a witch's teat. And apparently it's a mark that would happen from the suckling of a familiar, like we were talking about before, like the black dogs or a little devil.
Mm-hmm.
They'd be sucking on that, and that was a familiar that was supposed to be controlled by the devil, and they would send messages from the devil to the witch. So they had all these crazy theories. The first person to go to trial in Salem was 50-year-old Bridget Bishop. And, there was no defense attorney system in place. She just had to defend herself. And they had a strong testimony against her. She had been accused of witchcraft before, which I found interesting. She might have actually been into some sort of folk magic and witchcraft. There were witnesses who did repairs on her home years back, and they found poppets in between the stones of her walls. And the poppets had like little needles in them. So it kind of almost like what people think of as voodoo dolls. So she had that going against her, and along with spectral evidence, there was a man that spoke up and said that he woke up with her body just sitting on her chest. And women in the crowd at this time started screaming that they were getting hurt with pins in their body that was like Bridget's specter again and the devil attacking them. And they completely disrupted the courtroom. And again, that was just a proof of witchcraft going on. Nowadays in the 20th century, I found out that whole kind of hysteria is looked at as unintentional fraud. And it's just called mass psychogenic disorder, which causes a wave of mass hypochondria in the colonies. Women, like we said, were just mimicking systems of one another. There's also this other theory that it's called an ergot fungus in rye, which would cause seizures and fits. People would think, well, maybe they were just having those fits due to the fungus. But scientists kind of debunked that. They're like, that's really not what it was, because the fungus would have caused death in those girls. And not just like these fits and rages like on opportune moments in courtrooms. It sounds like it's more just like hypochondria at play.
Right.
But Bridget was found guilty, and she was the first person hung for being a witch. And another messed up fact I found out was that the hanging method in Salem was a really slow, painful death. The drop was short, like you would just be placed on a ladder and then pushed off the ladder. So you would be swinging and die slowly by strangulation, which is a process that can take up to like 10 agonizing minutes.
That is really messed up.
And just everyone standing and watching this go down.
Right.
So there were some more women to go on trial. It was Sarah Good and Susanna Martin. They were both convicted because they would not confess or accuse others of witchcraft. And it just kind of revealed that strange pattern that women who confessed would not be convicted because they wanted to encourage more confessions. But not everybody was willing to accept that plea bargain. The magistrates turned to this woman, Rebecca Nurse, and she kind of sticks out in the Salem witch trials because she was a religious woman and she was an active member in the church. So her family was preparing for this trial while she was in jail. They had petitions signed by over 30 villagers that spoke of her innocence. She was just known as being an upstanding citizen. So she was really fighting for her life. She did not fit the normal bill of outcast or troublemaker or anything like that. So the surgeon was named John Barton. He was examining her for the devil's mark, and he said that he found one on her body, which could have just been a mole or anything like that. But the court, they said that she was not guilty. They questioned her, and the jury didn't think that she was guilty at all. So that led to huge turmoil in the courtroom. Another just, outcry of these afflicted girls. Everyone was kind of pissed off that she didn't get, hung. So they told jury, hey, can you reconsider this decision? And they asked Rebecca to explain her mark. She remained silent, and they took this as guilt. So they just said, you know what, you're going to hang. So she was sentenced to hang after all.
What the heck did this girl do to deserve that?
I know, because she doesn't fit that whole outcast thing. So I don't really know how this happened. And the dynamic in Salem from that point really changed. So previously it was just a crime placed on poor women, people who were not religious. So this just proved that no one was safe. Elizabeth Howe and Sarah Wilds, they were convicted the exact same day. And so they took all three women up to the gallows. It was called Gallows Hill to face execution. And there's this minister, his name was Nicholas Noyes, and he gave Sarah Good one more chance to confess that she was a witch so that she wouldn't die a liar. Her response was, "You are a liar, and I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." So they said that her last words were from the Bible, which I didn't recognize, but
yeah.
And people really remember her words in history. Some even called it a curse. Because years later, Nicholas ended up dying from internal hemorrhage, and they said that he died choking on his own blood.
Dang.
Yeah, so that was just one of those things that people were like, she was a witch. But I don't think she was. It just was a crazy coincidence. So on June 2nd, John Proctor was searched and had his examination. They had 7 different men search him to try to find a sign of a witch's teeth, but they couldn't find anything suspicious. He had plenty of spectral evidence against him. And his own words and his actions kind of came back to haunt him because various witnesses testified that Proctor threatened or admitted to beating several people involved in the witch trials. One such witness was the man Samuel Sibley, who testified in court that Proctor admitted to beating Warren in an attempt to control her behavior. And during their conversation, Proctor said he was on his way to Salem to retrieve Warren so he could take her home and beat her. So, he had told people about all that, and it really came back on him.
I'm sure back then it was like, oh, you're just taking her home to beat her? Go
exactly. Like, okay, that's your right. He ended up being convicted of witchcraft, and his wife as well. So they were sentenced to the gallows. Elizabeth's sentence was delayed because she was still pregnant, so she ended up just waiting in jail for a really long time. And I'll go back to that later. When it was Minister George Burroughs' turn for trial, mass amounts of people showed up in Salem to watch this unfold. There were a lot of testimonies made. There was this girl, Mary Lewis. She just started talking about how his specter came to her and tried to get her to sign the devil's book, and that he was the leader of all of the witches. So Burroughs fought for his innocence, and it was said he was really calm and logical the entire time. He was just not buying into any of this hysteria. And he said there was no witches and no devils. There was nothing like that going on. And they looked at his open defiance to Puritan theology as blasphemy. And the jury just found him guilty.
Wow.
On August 19th, he was executed along with John Proctor, John Willard, and George Jacobs Sr. So this was, I guess, a day of executing men. The noose around Burroughs' neck, he started just reciting the Lord's Prayer. And this is something that witches were not supposed to be able to do. That was one of the things that they would ask people to do in court. Like, if you could recite the Lord's Prayer, then you couldn't have been afflicted by witchcraft. So this really freaked out the crowd, and everyone started just, going forward towards the ladders and trying to stop him from being hung. But actually that famous Reverend Cotton Mather, who was the author of these witchcraft books, he stepped forward, and he said, look, he's guilty, and this hanging is a just act. And he calmed everyone down.
Wow.
And so they were just ended up getting hung, and again, just slowly dying, swinging on the noose. So Cotton Mather had a lot to play into Salem witchcraft by scaring everybody with these theories and then just backing them up. So by the end of September, there were 9 more who would die by hanging. There was this guy, Giles Corey. He was a husband to accused witch Martha Corey, and he found himself being accused and drug into everything. And he pled not guilty. And he protested the whole trial by not really responding or playing along to anything. So they tried to force him to plead guilty. And they did this by placing him on the ground and piling stones, huge stones on his chest. And they just kept covering his entire body for 2 days. And in between, they would ask, are you guilty? And he would just respond, more stones. He's just fighting this whole system. So he died crushed by all these stones. Dang. But he went down never being convicted of witchcraft. Sadly, his wife was hung along with 7 others who refused to confess to witchcraft. And they would refuse to blame others in order to save themselves. They became martyrs in the resistance to the witch hunt. And these violent acts really inspired people to finally speak up. I don't think people were really happy to see this man crushed by stones. So more and more people in Boston just began to openly criticize the judge's methods. And this planted doubt in others who had actually openly confessed and accused others. There was this girl, she was 17 years old, her name was Margaret Jacobs. Her accusations helped hang Minister George Burroughs and her own grandfather, George Jacobs. After his execution, she dictates a letter to the judges, and she told them, what I said was altogether false, but they told me if I did not confess, I shall be put down in the gallows and hanged, but if I confess, I shall save my life. And that guilt must have really weighed heavily on her, and she didn't want to go on pretending anymore. So all these other people started recanting their confessions, and the judges just wanted to shut this down, so they just began to try those who had cooperated before, and say, look, if you're going to recant your confession, we're going to try you and you might get hung. So people stopped confessing altogether, and a lot of the wild accusations just came to a halt. It was kind of a turning point. People started getting really scared. And even Cotton Mather's own father, Reverend Increase Mather, wrote a powerful plea to the court. And it just covered the dangers of improper accusations, and history just kind of sums it up in one phrase that he wrote, that it were better that 10 accused witches should be spared than 1 innocent person should die. So in the end of October, the governor dissolved the Oyer and Terminer court system, and when the trials resumed, they would resume in regular courts, and spectral evidence was no longer allowed. But they would have to go through more trials, because accused witches were still in jail and they couldn't just be freed. They had to be brought through a judicial process, and in fact, 3 more people were even convicted after that, which is scary.
Yeah, for sure.
It did take 3 months before 49 others accused witches were released from jail. And in that time, 3 more died. It was a horrible process.
That is very horrible.
Elizabeth Proctor, she was still in there pregnant. She did end up having her baby in there, and she was freed. But, she had lost her husband. She had been stripped of her legal rights because of her convictions. And Elizabeth had discovered that John written her out of his will. And he probably...
Oh my God.
And I think they think he did this because she was going to die. He thought she was going to be hung. So So to make
Right.
matters worse, all of the proctor's belongings had been confiscated to pay their imprisonment fees. So most of these people who were released just had nothing and were left on the street and had no legal rights.
So she had no husband, this new baby, and no means to
Yeah,
live.
she couldn't even access her own dowry. So she was just left penniless like a lot of these women. It took Tituba up to a year to be released from her imprisonment because Reverend Samuel Parris did not want to pay her jail expenses, so he just left her in there. So she only got released when someone else became her new master. And after 1692, there were really no more accusations of witchcraft. People didn't stop really believing in witchcraft or folk magic, but at that time the legal system stopped engaging in folk magic beliefs that people's neighbors were witches any longer. It just wasn't tolerated. Years later, officials and participants slowly began to take back their mistakes made in the Salem witch trials. In 1703, the General Court of Massachusetts Bay Colony throws out most of the evidence used in the witch trials. And then in 1711, the colony begins to pay some monetary compensation for the families of the accused. It doesn't really sound like much. I think I was reading they'd get 50 pounds. But they were just trying to right the wrongs because like we said, they're all penniless and struggling. So there's a lot of dark stuff happened. And, if you flash forward all the way to 1970s, Salem, Massachusetts really started profiting from this whole paranormal stigma they had on them. When the TV show Bewitched aired, Salem's mayor declared it Bewitched Day. And eventually the show Bewitched was filmed several episodes there. And even today, you can go and see a statue of Samantha riding on her broom outside of town.
How
Yeah,
cute.
so they had this horrible stigma, and people would go there just trying to dig for more information. And for a long time, they tried to ignore the witch trials, and they just wanted to put it to rest. But they found that embracing it in a new fun light was what the town needed to breathe life into it again. And so Salem has now become a town full of real practicing witches. And they're all out of the broom closet thanks to this woman, Lori Cabot. She opened the first town's witch shop in 71. And others just followed suit. A bunch of people started flocking there and opening their own shops. People were really embracing their history and the tourism that was helping the town as well. They would flock to the city to see all the historical buildings from Salem's past that reside there. I think the tavern's still there, some of the family homes, things like that. They have erected a memorial there for the accused witches. And there are a lot of museums there too about the Salem witch trials. So it's just a huge tourist city now.
For something horrible that happened.
Yeah, it's kind of weird that it would get kitschy in that way. And some might think, is that disrespectful? Is that a disservice? But it's just the way that the town evolved,
Right.
So
right.
they even really embraced the name Witch City. I found out that policemen's badges on their shoulder, it has a witch riding on a broomstick and it says Salem, the Witch City.
Oh my gosh, that's so
It
cute.
is. I was I want that patch. So I know it's really my dream to travel there one day with you, and we can go check everything out and see these places and the memorials and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, I would love that. I remember when they had the Sabrina episode on TV that they traveled there.
Yeah, that's true. I read about that. And also Hocus Pocus had some exterior shots there.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So it's just become a paranormal hub, and even around Halloween they have these crazy Halloween festivals and celebrations.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Definitely. Well, let's wrap things up. So it was a really long episode today. I hope you guys learned something new about witches and witch trials.
Thank you for listening. Join us next Wednesday for another dark episode where we will be discussing demonology and possessions. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and check out our blog at cousinscoven.home.blog. We're also on YouTube, iTunes, and anywhere else podcasts can be found. Send questions or your paranormal experiences into cousinscoven2@gmail.com. And may you find happiness in your heart, love for yourself, and joy in each other. Blessings to all.